A humanitarian crisis in Iraq, sanctions from Russia, talk of impeachment, and the Africa Summit. I'm Simon Harrington, and this is The Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Simon Harrington. Joining us today are political consultant Leif Larson, Al Matei of topofthecircle.com, Isaiah Poole of the Campaign for America's Future, and policy analyst Ethan Roberts. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
First up today, the situation of Christian and other minorities in Iraq. Thousands of civilians have fled from Islamic State terrorists into mountainland areas, but many have been cut off from food and water in the process. The Obama administration is reportedly considering both airdrops of food and airstrikes against Islamic State targets. Ethan Roberts, does this situation involve the United States' interests? If not, should we do anything to help the civilians?
In the broadest sense of U.S. interests, saving people from suffering and death, yes, I think that's in everyone's interest. But in a more specific sense of the word, I think there are too many competing different interests to say, is it in U.S. interests or not? The actions today, it's happened. Hopefully they have positive consequences. I also hope that the people making the decisions keep in mind that even the best intentioned humanitarian efforts often go awry and lead to negative things down the road. And as far as airstrikes go, people die. So I wish the government would take the utmost caution in moving forward with that.
Isaiah Poole, your thoughts on the situation in Iraq?
Well, I think President Obama was wise to respond to the humanitarian crisis. He was also wise to point out that for those who are worried about losing Iraq, Iraq is not ours to lose. Iraq is a country that has to decide its own future. And our efforts in the past to shape that future for them, we see the consequences of that. So I think the best thing that we can do is to intervene to prevent humanitarian crisis or respond to those crises that occur. But then to be very clear that the divisions that exist in Iraq have to be resolved by the Iraqi people. We can help them resolve that, but it's their issue to resolve.
Al Matei, I think Dad.
This is one of the most interesting policy actions, I think, in the last maybe 50 or so years, at least in terms of the usual actions and dynamics of how diplomacy works. This is a case where you have a carrot and a stick at the same time being delivered in Iraq. And let's be clear here. The people who are receiving the aid need it. These are people who are stuck at the top of Mount Sinjar, without water, without food. Meanwhile, you have ISIS, or some people will say ISIL. These are bad actors. These are folks who not only might want to see an Islamic caliphate in the region of Levant, which encompasses Israel, Syria, Jordan, but also may want to extend the caliphate all the way from Pakistan all the way to Nigeria, which could also result in the extermination of many different types of peoples, tongues, and civilizations. It's unacceptable.
Okay, and Leif, any thoughts?
I think it's this strongly needed to be done. I find it confusing that we're saying it wasn't ours to go in there and save and do this. Of course it was. It's just like was mentioned earlier. This is not beyond a humanitarian crisis. This is a group of people committing genocide, beheading children, families, whole groups of people that they just disagree with for religious purposes. These people are not good. I don't see that there's anything on a negative side that can come back and hurt us, because these people have no reason to do anything with us. There's no carrot that we can offer them other than complete capitulation and letting them do what they want to do, which is to murder, kill, and rape. So, I'm not for putting boots back on the ground. I think this all came about since the Obama administration made a blunder in pulling our troops out with the notification that they gave everybody in that region, we will be gone by this time. Of course, everybody decided, well, we'll bide our time and we'll go when we're ready. These people have come in from the conflict in Syria, which the Obama administration let linger on and failed to get involved with. So I think the question we need to look at now is, who is funding these people? Where are they getting their weapons? They're not just coming in, capturing weapons and arming themselves as they go, like some type of Mongol horde. They have some type of funding for themselves. Who is funding this? How have they been able to go the distance that they have from Syria into Iraq and continue to commit these crimes? I think what needs to be done, and what the Obama administration probably rightfully is doing, is waiting out the Maliki administration in Iraq to disappear and go away, because they brought a lot of this on themselves by their actions there. But this has to be done, and I think it should continue to be done. It should not just stop at halting these advances. We need to go in and obliterate these people before they can take a foothold and build themselves, carve themselves out the state that they want, which would drive, I think, is never going to be anything but a festering sore in the Middle East.
But obliterate them with what if you're not going in with ground troops?
Well, we can hold their advances, keep them where they're at through our air power. It's not going to destroy them. Allow a change in administrations in Iraq to come about, and offer the Sunni and the Shiite factions there a combined government in Iraq, which would take a little bit of this wind out of the sails of ISIS and have them move on the ground as Iraqis to expel these invaders, which they are. And I think that's what we need to hold off and wait for. And I think what we need to do is we need to offer, day and night airstrikes for the Iraqi people to hold these people in check until a change in their own administration can come about. I'm not sure exactly when he's up for re-election, but I know it's coming soon, and I think there's been severe pushes within the country to have him step down, which he won't. But I think that's what we need to do. We can't allow ISIS to move any further into Iraq, into the Kurdish regions of the north, obliterating and committing genocide against those people. We need to stop them now. We should have stopped them when they were in Syria, but we need to stop them now.
Are we all in agreement with this one? Moving on.
My concern is with boots on the ground or airstrikes, it's all ignoring the fact that this political vacuum exists because of American intervention. And I'm not saying that Saddam Hussein was a good person who should have been a head of state, but all of this exists because of past interventions, and it's a legitimate question to say, what does current action cause down the road?
Well, I think when you talk about having Sunnis and Shiites, come together and decide what kind of government they want, what kind of leadership they want for the future. Well, first of all, Iraq is a sort of an artificial construct to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so there's a fundamental question about whether Sunnis and Shiites do want to have a unified government or whether they want to go their separate ways. I mean, certainly in our vision, it's nice to think of, I like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony, to pull that whole song together. Maybe that's not what they want. I agree with you that the idea of allowing that entire region to be dominated by a genocidal element is very wrong for our, not just for our long-term interests, but for the world's long-term interests. But I don't think you solve that by micromanaging, or superimposing our vision on their people and their culture.
I'll mildly disagree with your last point. I think you are going to have to put a little bit of the technocrat kind of leadership in certain places where maybe it might not have worked in the past. It's a leadership vacuum, as Ethan said, and so much of what leadership is seen in the Middle East are strong men with a lot of guns. Not people with ideas, not people with foresight or people with vision, just people who can instill fear in a populace, bring them down, and not even work to try and make better lives for people, but instead rule by an iron fist. And it's a different kind of leadership that from what anybody in the Iraqi region has had in more than 1,500 years, perhaps. I mean, has there been at least 2 turnovers, peaceful turnovers, of government in Iraq in its history?
Well, I would probably say not. I mean, I think it's also interesting, and kind of gets into what you're looking. I would have no problem with the Iraqi people deciding they want to divide the country up into several different regions, a Shiite and a Sunni controlled area, and let the Kurds take over the northern part of the country. I don't think the Turks would care for that, but I think that's where we're heading. Mm-hmm. I also think it's quite interesting that with this group of barbaric Islamic, I don't even want to say fundamentalists, because I think they're not even fundamentalists. They're just some type of horde that claims that they have this right under Islamic religion. But where are the Saudis? Where are the Jordanians? Mm-hmm. Where are the Egyptians? I think they're afraid of these people. I think they're afraid of their own internal collapsing. That if they move against these people, that they would see a possible uprising within their own states. So I think we've seen, and I don't think it's because of U.S. intervention in Iraq, but I think it's because of people becoming fed up with the existing governmental controls that they've had there. We saw a changeover in Egypt. Muslim Brotherhood took over. The army came in and got rid of them and has now moved back towards more of a Sadat type of presidential government. The Saudis are completely afraid of losing their kingdom and the families of who control it now. I think so is Jordan, which probably has the least effective military out of those governments in the area. So I think it's just a general lack of interest. We've seen, I guess, what was called the Middle East Spring of the Arab Spring has now dissolved into a cold winter where people are just completely dissatisfied, which gives rise to these type of groups of people who will pick up the gun and commit atrocities because they just don't see any future any other way.
Unfortunately, the United
Last word for you, Isaiah. Finish this one.
No, I was just going to say, unfortunately, the United States history has not helped us in terms of being a positive force in mediating all of that.
All right. Okay. Where are we? I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air toward the end of the show. Also this week, Russia announced sanctions against countries that have imposed sanctions on it for supporting separatists in Ukraine. The sanctions involve many imported food and agricultural products that will be absent from Russian shelves for the next year. Almaty, it's clear that Vladimir Putin is not backing down from Western pressure. Will these sanctions weaken Western resolve, or will they backfire on the Kremlin?
Vladimir Putin may be a strong man. He may gallop around on his horse with a bare chest, but I'm not sure whether this is the smartest move that he could have made. When you think about it, you're talking about withdrawing from your own people food aid, and you're punishing the U.S., the EU, Australia, Canada, Norway, and other customers that are sending food, or actually are customers in selling food to Russia. But what could happen, and I know that this is a calculated risk by Putin, because what he wound up doing in seizing Crimea and trying to seize parts of the Ukraine is to reclaim the old Russian wheat belt, so that they can actually start feeding themselves without having to rely on importing a lot of goods. But Putin has done this in a calculated way. This is only a one-year ban, and I can't see it being more than a year, because if you're going to withdraw food from the populace of Russia, you're also withdrawing it not just from the people who need to eat every day, but also some of the luxury goods that your oligarchs are enjoying. The oligarchs' standard of life may plummet, and the oligarchs are one of the only things that are keeping Putin in office. Not the best move by Mr. Putin, I don't think.
Ethan.
You had a hard time at first, and I share your befuddlement with this. This is just clear evidence that politicians are not the best and the brightest, and they are certainly not economically literate, because this is, we'll deny ourselves access to the best available products. If they weren't the best available, they wouldn't be on the shelves. I don't see the logic behind this. It's posturing. I don't know what to say about it.
Well, I think what we need to remember is President Putin comes from a different cut of what most Russians are today. He cut his teeth under the Soviet Union. He grew up, and his first workings were in the KGB. He is of the old ilk of, we can do without. We'll go and, stand in lines for rolls of, sandpaper, toilet paper, and be happy to have it. I think what he's miscalculating is that most of the people that he has as constituents, or as subjects, or whatever you want to call them under his rule now, don't see and don't remember and did not grow up under the same auspices as he and issues that he had. They're not going to like it, and I think it was a miscue on his part that maybe it's because he's not in touch with the group of the generation that's in Russia now. And I think it will backfire on him. I do think that the oligarchs, as in any culture or your state you go to, will find their way to get their cigars and their wine and whatever else they want. They have plenty of caviar, so it probably won't be a problem for them. But I think it's a miscue, but I don't think it will stop him. I think that he's already cast his die, and he's going to go into Ukraine and take what he wants. And I think this is just another reason. Maybe he's going to use this to whip up more support of, look what they've done. They've starved us out. They don't love us. Of course they never have, because they think Russians aren't worth a nickel. So let's go in and take Ukraine back and show the rest of the world they can't push us around. Seems like a backward way of doing it, but I can't see it either. So
Isaiah.
Well, it's this sort of complex in which the more you suffer, and the more you could set yourself up as the martyr, and then try to build public support around that, and say, okay, and I had to do this thing to strike out on our own, and yes, you're going to suffer because of that, but we are Russia, we are strong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, blah blah blah. It will backfire, and the one useful thing that the 1% could do there, just as the 1% often does here, is to yank his chain and say, get in line. Let's do something that change your policies, so that they actually make sense in the global community.
I think he's forgotten what the old American adage of it's hard to keep them down on the farm once they've seen the bright lights of the city. And I think that's what this generation of Russians have had, is the bright lights of the city. And I don't think they're going to sit around and want to go back to standing in lines at Gumps for, like I said, bad rolls of toilet paper when they can get them.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Did you want to?
Well, just maybe to put a bow on this, if Mr. Putin really wants to placate the populace with the bread and the circuses, I mean, he had an Olympics. He's got a World Cup coming up. But if you're not going to have the bread, what good is, you have a starving public, what good is your electorate?
Okay, all right. Moving on. There's been a lot of talk among the chattering classes about possible impeachment of President Obama. Republican leaders have downplayed it, even accusing Democrats of using it for fundraising purposes. At the same time, though, several Republicans have hinted that impeachment should be on the table if President Obama takes executive action on the immigration front. Leif Larson, let's clarify this situation. If Obama bypasses Congress in dealing with the situation at the southern border, should impeachment be on the table?
Well, I think first we need to clarify this whole argument, which is, as I always say, in Washington, is nothing but politics. First, the charge that Republicans have done nothing is completely false. Just as last week, the House of Representatives passed legislation that dealt with the current wave of minors coming across the border without proper paperwork. It changed the 2008 sex trafficking law, which has been abused and twisted to allow these children from everywhere but Mexico to come across and seek sanctuary without the immediate deportation that people from Mexico would face. I think it also addressed the fact in a way that the president had endorsed before he was forced to flip-flop on the issue by his own party. I think it provided emergency funding for these children. So the fact that they claim that the president has to do this because the Congress has done nothing is false. Secondly, granting amnesty to people is not going to do anything but worsen the issue. If you tell people you can come across the border illegally and eventually you will get amnesty and be able to stay here legally after that, does nothing but worsen the problem. These arguments mean little since presidential orders would be unconstitutional. And I will quote a few facts from a constitutional scholar who I think has a lot to say on this issue. I'll paraphrase some of his comments on this. A president swore an oath to uphold the laws on the books. Now, I know some people want the president to bypass Congress and change the immigration laws on his own. That's not how our Constitution is written. He also further says that the notion that somehow the president can just change the laws unilaterally is just not true. There are laws on the books that the president has to enforce. He also said that, in fact, the president could solve all these problems without passing laws in Congress, then the president would do so. But we are a nation of laws. I'll give the panel here 3 guesses who that constitutional scholar was that said these things. Anybody?
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't President Obama.
Exactly. It was President Obama who made it quite clear since 2011 when he first made these mentions that doing presidential orders in this manner would violate his oath and constitutional law. I think that has led to the chattering classes to talk about if this happens, what can we do? I think this act of lawlessness by the president would set the table for talks of impeachment, which the president knows would go nowhere because there's not enough votes in the Senate to convict him. But he also knows that when this first went out as a piece of direct mail fundraising by the DNC, they raised $1 million in a week. So I think the real question is, why is the president, who has many times stated that such an act would be illegal, is now talking about committing such acts? It's basically because he has an upcoming midterm election that his party is looking at a dismal defeats in, and he needs something to stir and to solidify his base, which, history has shown us nothing does that better than to have your president impeached. And then, waste a lot of money in the Congress, which is already at ultra low levels of popularity. So this is nothing but a popularity and a very well thought out political tactic on the White House's benefit. I don't think it's going to. I don't think impeachment was ever thought of until he floated out these ideas. But I don't think it's going to happen. I think if he does this August surprise when everybody's in recess we'd have to wait and see. But the big question is, if the president says doing so would be illegal, why is he now saying he would do it?
Isaiah Bull, why don't you take the
Then
first
what
response?
was House Speaker John Boehner talking about when he was talking about President Obama taking action on his own? I mean, it was Boehner who sort of put that on the table. It wasn't President Obama per se. The reason why we have a stalemate on immigration is the reason why we have stalemate on everything. The Republican Party, from day one, said that its objective was to make President Obama a one-term president. Having failed that in 2012, the Republican Party has continued to say that our objective, and John Boehner in the House and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, have been very clear about this. They've said that our objective is to keep President Obama from accomplishing his agenda, irrespective of whether that agenda is a good thing or a bad thing. That's why we are where we are. So when President Obama puts forward a package of proposals, about $4 billion worth, to address various facets of the immigration crisis, it immediately gets ripped apart by the Republicans in Congress, to the point that I think what the House passed was $600 million.
It was $768 million.
Yeah, but it was just a fraction of what the administration proposed. Much of that was just because, President Obama proposed it, therefore we're going to oppose it.
Yeah, but the thing is,
Why don't we let our other panelists say?
There's a lot of paths a lot of rabbit holes that could get lost in this one. Immigration. I'm a big fan of open borders. To tie this back to the very first topic, the best thing we could do to help people in humanitarian crises is open the borders, let them come here, give them the opportunity to make a better life for themselves. So immigration, certainly I'm on the side of liberalizing that. At the same time, there's no doubt that the Obama administration is guilty of hubris and executive overreach. There's a rich history of that in the executive branch. He's not alone in that. And as far as the impeachment talks, as was pointed out, it's just an impossibility. It's not going to happen. So it's just political games and chatter.
Al?
I'll just piggyback a little bit on what you just mentioned, that there's been a rich history of presidential and sometimes vice presidential aggrandizing of power since the Truman administration. You've had lots of undeclared wars. You have presidential directives which run everything from national security to exactly what order you have to notify people if you're going to fire a nuclear weapon. And I will have to say, though, you got to credit the President of the United States for cutting down on one particular aggrandizing of presidential power, and that's the presidential signing statement. George W. Bush put 1,200 presidential signing statements on nearly 200 bills, basically saying, oh, that's okay, you don't have to actually enforce this part of the law. And President Obama also has been further down on the list of most recent executives when it comes to executive orders. One more executive order on immigration is not going to change very much, I don't think, because, well, for one thing, it's not going to be a high crime, a misdemeanor, treason, or bribery. But that's just my feeling.
Then why do we have laws? If we give the president the power to do what he will in the enforcement of laws, then the next president, who might be a conservative, could say, well, I'm going to tell the IRS, don't enforce the tax levels for people who are rich. They pay 15%. Let it go. Don't enforce it. Where does that leave us? Where will the progressives be with that type of overreach of a presidential power? And signing statements are completely different than executive orders. Mm-hmm. The signing statement has historically been, I don't think this is a good part of the legislation, but I like it as a whole. I just want to let everybody know I don't like this. It has no legal bearing, and most presidents understand that. It's not a line item veto. But also the other thing is that Obama's presidential orders have been more active than they have been in the past, where people have said, well, we're going to, do it this way instead of doing it like it's been done in the past. His orders have been to negate aspects of legislation. So we've seen an increase in the imperial and presidential powers under Obama. Not maybe as many as other people have done in the past, but his have been more, proactive and reactive to legislation. So I think that's the problem, is if we continue to go down the road allowing the president to enforce laws as he will, willy-nilly, might as well write off our legislative branch.
Did you want one final word, Isaiah?
Well, what I would say is that for people who are concerned about executive overreach, what they need to do is make sure that we have a functional Congress, because a functional Congress is the cure for executive overreach. And we do not have a functional Congress right now.
We will have the midterms elections, I think. So.
I disagree, but
All right. Finally, leaders from dozens of African countries met in Washington this week for a major summit. There was lots of fanfare and major announcements. But Isaiah Poole, will anything come out of it, or was it just an expensive photo op?
excellent question. There were roughly $14 billion worth of business deals that came out of the Africa Summit, because people were like Walmart, General Electric, some of the other major American companies were brought in, along with officials from the Commerce Department and so on, to begin to do deals. Walmart announced that it's going to do $3 billion farm program with to sort of working with farmers in 3 African countries to supply fruits and vegetables for something called Mass Mart, which is sort of the Walmart equivalent in parts of Africa. The United States still is way behind China, and I don't think people realize how far behind China we are. China and Africa have done about $200 billion worth of trade last year. The United States is a little bit more than half that. The United States is going to increase the number of business consulates it has to 8. China already has more than 50. So there is that aspect of it. The other question is the relationship that we have with Africa, the business relationship we have with Africa, a mutually beneficial developmental relationship, or is it an exploitative extraction relationship? It's the question that's being raised with China, because China's gone into these countries. They've actually shipped about a million workers into China to help with the mining and extraction of raw materials. Real questions about whether instead of shipping in 1 million Chinese workers, they should actually train 1 million African workers to do that work. And whether in fact should China be commandeering all of these resources anyway, or is it the country's business then to the individual countries to market those resources? Real concerns about, in competing with China, whether we end up creating those same negative relationships.
Okay, why don't you end?
It's a lot there. That's a mouthful. I wouldn't say it's a competition or a race with China. China becoming a larger economy benefits the United States. I don't think there's anything to be afraid of in China expanding, even if their trade is 3-4 times as much with Africa as the United States is. The original question of will anything come of this, I doubt it. Most of these multilateral gatherings are meaningless. They don't change the institutions on the ground. The politicians attending them face the exact same incentives when they go home, which lead to the exact same dysfunctional market outcomes at home. I don't see anything really coming of this. Hopefully, it might. Greater investment is a good thing. We'll see.
Leif, your thoughts on the African summit?
Where's the camera at? Oh, there it is. Do I look okay? I think that's what we saw. To all credit to the President Obama, he had a tough act to follow in what previous presidents have done there. George Bush set up a legitimate government in southern Sudan to stop the genocide that was going on there. He initiated, I think it was an AIDS program with $15 billion, which has been universally credited with drastically reducing the spread of the disease in that country, in that continent. And he also set up a thing called the Millennium Challenge Corporation to boost foreign aid to Africa. This was a way for the president to escape other things that have been giving him sleepless nights, and to give him a softball arena where he could hit things out of the park that weren't even really questions that had to be had. He just had to show up. I mean, he has a 67-70% popularity in the continent of Africa, and I think just by showing up, it gave him a couple nights of rest and recuperation from such things as having to face problems in Gaza and Israel, the Ukraine issue, and also his plummeting popularity in this country. So I think it was more or less a photo shoot, but I did like the one thing that the president said, which was he made the statement that nations of Africa should be aware of people bearing gifts that seem to be just giving them everything that they want without any asks at the beginning, and then later on finding out that their country has been raided 6 ways to Tuesday, which I think is what the Chinese are looking to do.
Al, was it a photo op?
I will disagree with my learned friends on the opposite side of the table, because I think so much of what is going to come out of the Africa Summit was either done behind closed doors in other buildings within the State Department complex, in the hotels, and also in meetings previous to that in and around Washington, D.C. I got a feeling that this was going to be much more than just a donor conference when I heard a speech by Steny Hoyer, the minority whip, I should say, from the state of Maryland. He came through and talked about what some of the goals were. Then he came across, at the end of a paragraph, he uttered the phrase $14 billion. It was supposed to be an applause line, but nobody applauded. I think a lot of it is because there is a certain amount of donee fatigue amongst folks in Africa. They don't want to see large checks. They don't want to see pledges. They instead want to see education. They want to see infrastructure. They want to see electricity. I think the two things that you're going to see coming out of this particular conference, one is Power Africa, which is a project which is scheduled to try and get 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa basic electricity so that they can even turn on lights, cook food, and maybe get access to education through the internet. The other thing that I think is going to come out of this is a project which is on the drawing board at USAID. It's called the Global Development Lab, and it is going to be a partnership between universities, colleges, foundations, and various other types of organizations in and around the DC and around the country to create projects where principal investigators in developing countries will get to do their own science and health and technology projects, and to be able to do their own science, do their own types of learning, to be able to build capacity so that you can get education, that you can get an infrastructure, you can get water, you can get clean air. And I think Global Development Lab, look for this in the next 5 years. It's going to be big.
If I can say, you
Why don't you
mentioned
take the
that,
last word on this one?
you mentioned that Obama having some sleepless nights. The things that give me sleepless nights are politicians and bureaucrats making deals behind closed doors. And if you think that foreign government aid is the solution, I got a piece of land in Florida to sell you. I mean, we're decades and trillions of dollars into this hole, and it's hard to do good with other people's money. I wish the government would stop spending other people's money on wastes.
I think the one thing we also have to remember is we can't. We as different from the Chinese have also offered things to Africa and told its leaders, but in exchange for our help, we'd like you to change your human rights viewpoints on certain things. Well, the Chinese really don't care about human rights. We don't care if this group of people are going to get most of the profits and you're going to keep this other group of people out of it. We don't care. We just want your minerals. I think we can't move away from that, because if we do, then I think we've stepped back in a position of leadership that we've been the guiding principles on in the past.
Okay. We're going to close it up with that, and we're going to take our questions from our viewers. And our first question comes from Albert Neal. He would like to know, if impeachment is not on the table, then what does Congress have on the presidency? Wouldn't Obama have a blank check?
Me? It seems to me like increasingly over the years, nobody has anything on the presidency. It already is a blank check to do what they want. NSA, if you're listening, sorry, I didn't mean it.
Well, to some extent, there may be a few areas where that is true, but let's look at the economy. The Republicans wanted cuts in spending. And what they got was an annual deficit which is dropping at a faster rate than it has at any time in modern history. We are living very much in a Republican budget. There was a little bit of a top-end tax increase as a part of the budget deal in 2011, but most of the economic decisions have been under Republican constraints. I mean, that's a direct product of the kind of obstruction of the Republicans.
Well, of the Constitution. I mean, that's what the Constitution was written for. We want restraints from the minority on the ability of the majority to push through anything they want.
But that undercuts the argument that there has been this sort of blank check that the president can write and do whatever he wants.
The president doesn't have a blank check. Oh, come on, people. The Congress still has the purse strings. If a president is popular enough, he can push through $787 billion, for example, to prosecute the war in Iraq. But in this case, I don't think it's going to be a blank check. I think it's going to be something that's targeted. I think it's going to just be moving of resources and hopefully cutting down the time necessary to process the children coming in, and hopefully, through the meeting a couple of weeks ago with the presidents of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, give them some backbone so that they're not so feckless in being able to prevent their own people from leaving their country.
I think the deal between Guatemala and Mexico was the fact that they wanted them to leave their own countries. That's why Mexico gives them a 72-hour visa to get to the border of the United States. Don't stop in our country if you're a refugee. We just want you to continue on to the U.S.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
I mean, yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder if this was something that had been in the workings for a long time. But I don't think the president has a blank check either. I think he'll stop short of committing a breach of his oath of office. I just can't see any person in the position of being a president that would want to be the first person to say, "I have unlimited power." I mean, look how it worked for Nixon.
Right.
All right. Our next question, Katrina Hunter would like to know, how much of the Iraq situation is Bush's fault for getting us in there, and how much is Obama's fault for getting us out of there? Isaiah.
Well, I'm on the side that says that we should not have gone in under the conditions that we went in, and I think President Obama's instincts were right in getting us out. I'm not quite sure if I were in the White House, I would do it exactly the way he did it, but his instincts were right, and the burden at the end of the day is on the Maliki government. They had a chance to create a functional government, a functional democracy, and they blew it. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I would probably as some people on the panel here would blame more on President Obama, as others would blame more on President Bush for getting us into the Iraq War. I don't know if you could point to either one as being the pivotal person that caused this explosion now. I think it, like you said, it's more or less the fact that we saw a government rise in Iraq that was not the best people to take the reins of power and run with it.
So once again, a failure in leadership.
All right. So, okay, and now it's time for our most underreported story of the week. Isaiah, why don't we start with you and we'll go around the table this way.
Well, everybody knows about the Toledo water crisis, in which the town of Toledo had to have its water shut off because of a poisonous algae bloom. What people, I don't think, know is sort of what led up to that. And one of the things that one of our writers did on ourfuture.org this week was look at the actions of companies like Monsanto and Koch Industries, the big fertilizer makers, and their efforts to block regulation that might have prevented the agricultural runoff that led to these poisonous algae blooms. If we had better regulation, this stuff wouldn't happen. But Lake Erie is in trouble. And the one thing I would say is watch this thing that they did in, I believe, Iowa, where they passed the Right to Farm Act, which will make it even tougher for governments to do things like control agricultural runoff.
Al, why don't you go next?
I'll go back to the USA Africa Leaders Summit. I heard a line spoken by the Namibian First Lady, Lordina Mahama, and I think it speaks to some of the optimism that being able to be with your other African leaders can give you, at least in terms of being able to think large, to think globally, and to think big, and maybe do something for your people. There is an effort to try and eradicate cervical cancer in Africa by 2030, which is an absolutely remarkable goal given the fact that 500,000 women and girls obtain cervical cancer for lack of the HPV vaccine. Now, mind you, a lot of people that I know, are a little bit afraid of vaccines as a construct, and are perhaps would be opposed to allowing prepubescent women the chance to get the HPV vaccine. But if we know that something works, why not?
Leif.
My story is based on, it's been an ongoing issue that I think points to the fact that the Obama administration is anything but transparent. There's been groups of reporters and other organizations that have been going around from state to state with their own state-run healthcare websites, trying to find out information regarding the people who are the navigators of these sites. They've filed for release of the information on these people, and even in fact in California, that has a sunshine law that says you got to let everybody see everything that's going on. They came back and said, well, even with the sunshine law, we think it would be derogatory to the healthcare system if we told you what you want to know would be more dangerous than not telling you. So we're going to not tell you and give you information on this. The Department of Health is withholding information regarding the security of those sites and its own. I think, when you combine that with the loss of emails by the IRS and everything else, this is quickly turning into something that rivals the Nixon administration for failures, cover-up, and everything else. I think, somebody should remind the president and his administration it's not usually the crime, it's the cover-up of the crime that causes you problems. I think this is an ongoing issue that is not getting any real coverage, but I think it eventually will.
All right, and the last most underreported story of the week.
I think somebody needs to check into district law enforcement, because last week apparently more than 530 of the nation's worst thieves and con artists managed to escape the district. They're going out around the country, I assume, to steal and con people. And in about a month they're coming right back, but somehow they've escaped the notice of district law enforcement.
I've lived here for 10 years. It doesn't surprise me.
All right, well, we'll leave it on that one. So that's all for this week, and thanks for watching this Square Circle. We'll see you next week.